Um, okay. So happy that you have not left me, although it might be complicated, but I'm trying to make it simple. So we can proceed with the second part, which is an introduction to Pierre Sarkar's concept of microvita. So now, before going into the details of Baba's concept, let me start not from a philosophical and mystical perspective, but from the perspective of science. And just to open the field, I would like to mention Gotthard Günther. He was a very interesting philosopher. And in 1951, he said something remarkable. He said, if it is true that space itself has an inner structure subject to physical influences, then this inevitably results in the idea of a third technology that primarily manipulates not matter and energy, but space itself. This means he puts, he brings a weird idea which before him nobody was able to think even about. He puts space as something which can be manipulated. So in order to think in this direction, we have to understand what space is and what space has been. So let us start with René Descartes. It is the one who created this abusive word of imaginary numbers, which Leibniz was opposing, and he said this is not the right term. But once it was introduced, it could not be changed. Even today, it is called imaginary numbers, and it goes back to René Descartes. So René Descartes, he made a philosophy which became very influential, and he defined space not as something concrete, but as a category. A category is something which exists only in the mind. This was his concept of space. For him, space was not something objective. It was something subjective, a category. Then 100 years later, Newton finished this idea of category. And instead of category, he said space is an object. It is an object which is empty, but still it is an object, and that object is called the void. And within this void, we can have coordinates, and we can have points with which we can calculate. So like in this graph, using coordinates and vectors. Then came Einstein, and another 200 years later, and he said that space is not completely empty. It is not completely empty void. It is not the same everywhere, but it changes. Of course, in space, also for Einstein, there is no matter, but there are fields. There are electromagnetic fields and gravitational fields. And this graph, for example, shows the gravitational field near a black hole. So at black holes, the gravitational field becomes very extreme. And it shows, and this is the fact, that the void is not empty, but full of fields. Georges Lemaitre is the one, not Einstein, it was Georges Lemaitre, a Jesuit priest who was engaged also with physics. Interesting. A priest doing physics. And he came to the conclusion that there must have been a Big Bang And from the Big Bang, which is on the left side, the whole universe developed in steps. First, there is an inflation of space, and then there is a long period of creation of matter, and only recently the space expands again unproportionally. So this is the Big Bang theory of Georges Lemaitre. Now, the question was, is this space really empty? And quantum theory says it is not really empty, but it is filled with what is called quantum foam. So this shows how we can imagine quantum foam, a bubbling of energies appearing and disappearing irregularly. So this quantum foam becomes apparent only at very high resolutions. And if this is the highest resolution, and if we go in other scales of magnitude, we don't see it. Here, the vacuum is completely flat. If we go into higher resolution, we see a slight unevenness, and even higher resolution, then we see this bubbling, which was depicted in this previous clip. So this was explained for the first time by Archibald Wheeler. Now we have to shift a little bit unconventionally from physical space to mental space. When we talk about mental space, we usually think that mental space is something created by our brain. And only human brains are supposed to create mental space. Within that mental space, all our imaginations, all our thoughts, all our sensations appear and disappear and become conscious. So mental space is a precondition of consciousness. Without mental space, we would not be conscious. And we think that this consciousness is, I mean, not we magis, but general people think that this consciousness is is only in humans. So when we see an object, there's a reflection in our mind which mirrors that object in our mental space. This is the basic operation. Now, to become stable, I mean, the reflection, if it is there only for seconds, then we cannot do much with it. But if that reflection becomes stable and can be combined with other reflections and other thoughts, then it becomes operational. So it must become stable, and then the consciousness becomes productive. And there's a theory which is the integrated information theory, which shows very nicely how this stabilization of ideas can be simulated in a computer model. Now, what is the significance of these computer models? The problem is that there are many things in the world which we cannot understand and where we don't know the exact reasons why it is as it is. For example, the weather is a big miracle, how it is sometimes like this and sometimes like that. So scientists have created models of meteorology, and similarly, they have created models of consciousness. And then, if you have a model, you can adjust it with the facts of reality, and then you can allow the model to run and see whether it coincides, whether the predictions of the model equal the reality. And usually they don't. And then you can adjust your model. And if you have adjusted your model sufficiently, and even in longer periods of time, the predictions equal the result of the facts, then you can say your model is good and the model is useful. So this is why we are using models. And we are using such models also in Microvita, because we can't see the Microvita. But if we have a model of Microvita and it works and it goes along with our predictions, then it is useful. This doesn't mean that the model is the same like the Microvita in reality, but the model allows us to operate and to work with these Microvita. If the model is good, it has to be adjusted to the reality. At least it has to be adjusted to Baba's discourses. This is the first and minimum condition. And then it has to be adjusted to the applications in reality. So here we have the integrated information theory, and it is quite useful for questions on consciousness. But then there is a problem with this information theory, integrated information theory, because this theory is not able to understand even and to conceptualize the qualia. Qualia means the subjective part of our perceptions. So when we feel something, then this has a special meaning to us. It is significant to us. It is a subjective feeling. And that subjective side of perceptions cannot be depicted and mirrored in such computer models. Those who were the first to find this difference and this problem, that the qualia are not able, that the qualia cannot be modeled in such computer models, they made the example on not how it feels to taste a strawberry, or how it feels to be fearful, or how it feels, but how it feels to be someone. For example, how it feels to be a bat. This was the iconic example which was used by those people who found this difference. And this is also the reason why robots and machines are fundamentally different from humans, because humans have these qualia. They have that subjective side of the experience, and machines cannot. They cannot have that subjective side. All the other things can be simulated by machines, but the subjective side cannot be simulated. Now here comes again Elizabeth Rauscher and her co-workers into the picture. I showed you the photo before. And she adds imaginary space to the conventional three-dimensional space. And by adding this, she, again, you have seen this before, the light cone. This is the real light cone, and in 45 degrees shifted, we see the imaginary light cone. And with this light cone, we can conceptualize the imaginary and the subjective side of existence. Now, in panpsychism, this is now again a philosophical thing. In panpsychism, there has always been said that the the mind is not limited to humans, but the mind is a, a unique feature of everything in this universe, so that the universe is filled with mental processes, although, of course, these mental processes are of a very primitive type. There is no doubt that a stone will not have much mental activity. But in principle, there is some minimal mental activity even in stones and even in the most simple existence in this universe. So this is panpsychism. It means pan is the world, and psychism means there is a psychic events happening everything in the world. This view of panpsychism, as I told you before, was very prevalent in the times of Renaissance and maybe until 1650 or so. And I have made this table to show how elaborate the philosophical space concerning this topic was in those times. Various writers and philosophers have dealt with this topic in different ways. So the names are given here. They are not very much known, but just to give justice to them, I have mentioned their names and their birth, their life data. So these people have worked on imaginary space. And Leibniz, he was also a believer in panpsychism. He said that everything in this universe is equipped with something which you might call primitive soul. And everything in this universe is able to perceive. But this perception is not in the way like we perceive things. It is a type of perception which goes without sensory organs. It is a perception of the soul. It is something like precognition, which Elizabeth Rauscher was working on. So these things are very interesting. And such perceptions, which bypass any sense organs, they are the basic mechanism of the monads, which Leibniz was describing as the basic building blocks of the universe. He didn't believe in any atoms. He said the basic building blocks of this universe are tiny souls, and they know about each other, not directly like we do, but by precognition. It is a perception of the soul. Now we come to Pierre Sarkar. This is the link where he fits perfectly. And of course, he is also advocating the idea that consciousness is a ubiquitous feature of the universe. And all entities are endowed with some type of consciousness. That consciousness might be dormant, it might be developed, but it is never absent. And in his Microvita in a nutshell, he elaborates this idea so that scientifically interested people can get rich inspiration from this idea. Of course, it is too much to think that we can earn money with these ideas. It is also too much to think that we can make patents in the patent office or some inventions which bring big benefit to humanity. Maybe later, but now we simply have to try to understand what he says. And understanding is a process where we always put things which we learn into the context of what we have already learned. So it is a necessary step for us to bring it in the context of what we know from our cultural background. In other parts of the world, they will bring it in the context of their background. But this is not possible for us. We have to bring it into our cultural background. This is what I'm trying to convey here. Now, this we have already talked about. I'm just repeating that there is a silver lining between matter and abstract. And in that silver lining, we have to look for the microvita. And he also says, this is also repetition simply, but as a repetition, it might be possible that you remember it more easily later. He says that atoms are the constituents of matter and ideas are the crude ideas are the basic constituents of microvita. So in 2003, this is also long ago, 22 years ago, with Vimalananda Dada, we came to this concept. And the main thing is that in the lower part of these triangles, we find matter, and the most subtle form of matter are the quarks. And in the upper part of these two triangles, we find the vacuum fluctuations. So the idea was that there must be an interrelation between vacuum fluctuations, which is a crude idea, and quark, which are the subtlest forms of matter. And with this, we came to Baba's four-chamber model. Actually, four-chamber model is described in the last chapter of his book. So the book goes through various topics, but the last chapter is Microvita and cosmology. And in that last chapter, he describes the four-chamber model. Why four chambers? He says there are four chambers because he divides into the subjective and the objective part, and he divides horizontally into something which we can, he calls it A and B, but we can make it more understandable by calling it complemented and reduced. So we are talking about subjectivity and objectivity, and complemented and reduced can be translated in an old concept of European philosophy, which is potentiality and actuality. So there is something potential and something actual. So when it comes from the potential state to the actual state, this happens actually in the collapse of the wave function, which is a basic event in quantum physics. In quantum physics, we get the collapse of the wave function where a state which is described potentiality in potential form becomes actual. So what is a space of possibilities? When we say that this Schrödinger equation exists in the space of possibilities, it means that there are possible events, and usually they are conceived only as a mathematical construct. But in philosophy, we can understand these possibilities as ontologically real. And then we have the space of actualities. That is when the potentiality becomes concrete, becomes factual. And this shift from the first to the second state is what is important in this four-chamber model. Because these red arrows, they indicate the shift from one chamber to the next one, and the shift from this one to the third one, and the shift from the third one to the fourth one. And actually, this is what Microvita do. Microvita are able to transform something from one chamber or space to another one. As I said, the space is supposed to be equipped with subjective dimensions. And then there are entities which allow for these interactions between the subjective and the objective state. And these entities are called microvita. They operate in the model. In reality, they might operate whatever they do. We don't know. But we can model it. We can use a model to make it more understandable. And that model uses the imaginary numbers. And as I said before, the imaginary number gives multiplied with 1, gives, and so on. We were talking about it. And this picture I've also shown. And these multiplications can be repeated and iterated again and again. So in this way, the content becomes stabilized. Now, I think this is the last picture which I have to show you, and my time is also almost over. This picture is a graphic of Cornelius Escher, and it has something to do with what we were talking this evening up to now. Because in the center, this is the origin where the principles are one and then they unfold. So regarding space, originally we have light cones, and the first light cone ever is the light cone which is created by the Big Bang. And then with every incident, with every entity, a new light cone is created. And as time passes, the light cones become smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is the periphery where the light cones are very, very, very small. So actually we can say that with every baby which is born, a new light cone is created. Every human being has one light cone. And they all exist in the periphery of this circle. And within every light cone, they are very small. Originally, it is huge, of course. The whole universe is one light cone. But it creates generations and generations of light cones. And every living being is one light cone. And within this living being, there is an interaction between its subjective and its objective part. And this interaction, it is not done by sensory organs. It is not a physical interaction. It is an interaction done in the model by Microvita, which is a multiplication of imaginary operators. This is the model to show how this interaction between the subjective and the objective part of every being works. So with these ideas, we have in the last 22 years made quite a number of conferences and seminars, except the books which I showed before. We have published in various journals, also in our Ananda Marga Gurukul. And now we have the Proud Now magazine, an online magazine which everybody can look. And in Proud Now, I'm proud to say that 60 publications have been published so far, 60. For those who are interested in getting more into the subject, I would recommend this article of a Norwegian philosopher, Hedda Mørch. She wrote this article, Is Matter Conscious? Very interesting, very profound, and very good. And Valia Allori, an Italian philosopher, who wrote Quantum Mechanics and Consciousness, also very good. And she brings the panpsychism in an understandable light. So I thank you very much that you were able to follow me up to this height. We have websites like Microvita EU, microvita.org, and we have the Institute of Microvita Research, so that if you are interested, please join us and collaborate. Thank you very much. Namaskar. Didi?
Yes, I'm here.
Everything came across?
Yes. Can I
Good.
stop it now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, one moment.